Greetings and salutations, listener. It is I, Eric J. Chucci, joined, as always, by the boy.
Hey.
And this is the Two Nerds podcast, where the podcast can't be late if you change what day it's on.
That's correct.
We have fucked up and forgotten to record the podcast until Monday for enough days now that...
We've decided that something about our lives has necessitated that the podcast now goes up on Tuesday.
Late Monday night, early Tuesday morning. Depends on what kind of life you live, what path you follow in this weird world of ours.
Exactly.
Today we're talking about dwarves.
Dwarves.
There's a lot of weird energy in the Two Nerds household today.
Like,
I feel like the harbinger for most of it.
it's what you deserve.
Yeah. This is going to be the first part of our ongoing series. We're going to start with races and see where that gets us and go from there. And there's a lot of races in Dungeons & Dragons, both completely 100% published book approved and those that are still sort of in the errata or in supplements or on the Unearthed Arcana, not quite yet 100% approved.
We use all of them pretty interchangeably, to be honest. And Dwarves is a good way to get started, because of all the fantasy races...
It's the one that's first in the player's handbook.
And it's the one that people change the least often. Normally, even in a fantasy setting that's otherwise pretty out there and has a lot of different interpretations of a bunch of different stuff, your dwarves are still basically going to be dwarves.
It is both a blessing and a curse, because dwarves are like a universal constant. You know, you can set your clock to a dwarf, but at the same time, dwarves are everywhere. Even Overwatch has dwarves.
Yeah, Torbjorn is just a dwarf. He's just a fantasy dwarf. And, that's pretty cool. I like that they're everywhere. I like that there's a concept that everyone just sort of agreed, no, this is good as is. Sometimes they'll mix it up a wee little bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll have, Orzammar dwarves who are American.
In accent, and indeed, geez.
Indeed, pretty much just dwarves.
Yeah.
I really like that. I really like the constancy of dwarves. Because it provides a nice contrast to a bunch of other fantasy races where every setting is going to have its own very unique take on it. Whether it be, J.R.R. Tolkien, I like him, let's just do what he did. Or whether it be, R.A. Salvatore, I like him, let's do what he did.
Do you approach all DMing, with that voice?
In my head?
Yeah?
No.
Oh, okay. So... In speaking about races, there's a modicum of structure here.
Okay.
He's shooting back to the old days of the Two Nerds podcast. Let's both be really quiet and awkward.
Oh, good. Good.
So, what do you like about dwarves? About the bog standard Dungeons and Dragons book, dwarves. What pleases you about these people?
I like that they're very traditionalist. Mm-hmm. I like that they are pretty uniform in terms of culture. You'll get, in many settings, you'll get dwarven kingdoms that are vastly differentiated from one another by distance. They're, entire kingdoms, continents apart, and the dwarves are still dwarves. I like that because it provides, like I said, it provides a constant, a nice contrast. Mm-hmm. I like the stuff that they're good at making only a little sense for people who live underground. Because it's very clear that this is not a race that was built up to be logically consistent. It was a race that was built up to be fucking awesome.
One of the things I like about that argument in general is that it's not even like that in the real world. There are a lot of cultures that do things that make absolutely no sense for their location and needs.
Yes, I know. That's one of the great... Culture being something that is mostly divorced from utilitarianism is something neat. As if, for instance, I love that dwarves use axes.
Yeah.
Axes are the worst tunnel fighting weapon. Every other version of, a medieval martial weapon is better for fighting in a tunnel than a fucking giant axe.
Right. And the traditional dwarven weapons are axes and hammers. Hammers make a little bit of sense because they're supposed to be renowned smiths. They come from mines and caves, have a lot of natural rock and metal nearby. Hammer makes sense, but axe?
Axe make no sense. Axe is axe is not good for that. It has a big, wide arc. It's not really useful for splitting stone. That's a chisel. That's a different tool. And it's a different tool for a very, very good series of reasons.
I would relish a dwarf to come at me with a chisel.
Just a hammer and chisel. I'm gonna carve you into shape, boy.
You got a wee bit extra in your face. Tink, 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 tink.
No, because it's still like a battle. So he like tosses the chisel up in the air and then baseball swings the hammer and just pins you to the wall. But that would actually make more sense than using axes.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that they use these big, overdeveloped, ridiculously overwrought, honestly bad axes. Because it's such a really good way of getting culture across, and it's a really cool visual. They're not as cool looking with spears. I know spears are better for them. Calm down, sword nerds on YouTube. I can hear you all and all your vague Nordic accents.
You know what, sword nerds on YouTube? Come at us. Write in the comments about how wrong we are.
Yeah, go ahead, Scholargrim.
Share it with your sword nerd friends and tell them to tell us how wrong we are, please.
I know we're wrong. I don't care. I love that they have such a well-developed look that you don't need to mess with it. If you say he's a dwarf, bam, all your players know exactly what to look for.
Yeah, red hair, black hair. What are we talking here?
Red hair, black
Blonde?
hair, big beard, probably braids, maybe some gold stuff in the braids. Long hair, has an axe, wearing very covering clothing, has a deep Scottish brogue.
Unless, of course, they specifically mention that they're like a tunnel warrior. In which case, Seamus, but smooshed down a little
Yeah, Seamus, but then you put him in a wine press. And you gave him the axes that are on all his ring gear.
Yeah.
Great. A+. It's one of the reasons I like Seamus. He's essentially a dwarf. He's
So you
just
remember-
the biggest dwarf ever.
There
He's
was-
the king.
One of the dwarves in Dragon Age looks like Seamus when he had the King Seamus gimmick in the original Dragon Age.
Mm-hmm. Balin.
Yeah. Homeboy looks like King Seamus before he got his big mohawk.
And now he looks like a Warhammer dwarf.
Yeah. He's going to cover himself in blue and pierce things and come at me.
I have a lot of things to say about how much I like dwarves and how much I like their culture as is. I'm going to mention one more thing is that I love that there's a bunch of different dwarven stuff that is actually kind of specific to different, like Warhammer dwarves, and they're very specific way that they're like the troll killers or whatever they're called,
Yeah.
with the mohawks and the twin axes and the body paint, the very Celtic styling. You can just slot one of those in with normal dwarves and it doesn't seem out of place.
Yeah, dwarves are universal in that, all the parts fit.
They're like the Lego system. All the dwarves fit together.
Yeah, they're the opposite of Apple products.
Ooh. What do you like about dwarves?
What do I like about dwarves? You mentioned that you like that they're traditionalists, and I like that they're traditionalists and not the bad guy.
Ooh, that's a good point.
Since time immemorial, but like especially the 80s, there's been, I was born in the 80s, so my frame of reference is more there, but there's been this sort of backlash against, your ways, old man. Hell, the 50s. I mean, that's what, rebellion has existed forever. But as a thing of cultural significance, and as our culture has been able to spread better because of the internet and mass communication, tear down your traditions for the sake of tearing down your traditions has become somewhat of a mantra. So the people who want to uphold those traditions say you not being able to dance in this specific town are viewed as the villains by default. But dwarves, despite being harsh traditionalists, are stubborn at worst.
Yeah, they're kind of stodgy.
Yeah.
Like, as a people. They're not described as just the bad guy. Oh,
There's that old heater.
it's fine.
You guys
Just
are
let
living
it go.
with it today. It's cold out there. The podcast is rescheduled spontaneously, and you get to listen to the heater. Could the cats start having a row in the middle of the living room? That would be the trifecta. Can we get Train in here?
Give it time.
But yeah, I like that they're traditionalists and they're not automatically bad guys. I like that you can have that kind of, presence in your games. to where, you can bring up these ideas and have these kind of characters, and they're not going to immediately be met with your chaotic party members or your more, idealistic party members immediately trying to tear them down. Now that's in a broad sense. I mean, also, I like a lot of the things you talked about. I don't know, they work really well. Dwarf is a really good trope.
And it's one that's, unlike some other races we're going to cover in the future, where I do have issues and I feel that they have stuff in their standard, out-of-the-box fluff, not even necessarily 5th edition, just their out-of-the-box, everyone sort of understanding of them that is cruft, that could be used, that you could shave off and make them better. Dwarves don't have that.
Honestly, the worst sin about dwarves is that they're a little boring.
Because every dwarf is, to a certain extent, Durkon Oakenshield. Unless you specifically make the rebel. Unless you specifically make the "you can't control me, Dad" dwarf, which I am currently playing, by the way. I talk about how much I love traditionalists. The dwarf I'm playing, and the only dwarf I've played in many years, is the absolute Drizzt of dwarves.
Well, and that's, that's another great reason for there to be traditionalism that isn't,
it isn't inherently evil.
Yeah.
It allows your rebel to not be inherently good.
Or allows your rebel to for their struggle, the thing they're rebelling against, to not be the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, it makes it more personal, because they're not, an escaped former slave of the horrible, chaotic, evil goddess's torture realm. They're just, I don't know, they're stodgy and boring, and I don't want to do that stuff. None of it's for me. I want to play music. That's a more personal and therefore more easily partyable story.
Yeah. But dwarves have fallen into the I don't really want to play along with humans for me personally lately. I love them. I have nothing against them. And humans, for that matter. I keep a spreadsheet of all of my role-playing game characters. I've played a lot of fucking humans in my time. I have nothing against them. They're just, God, I've done it a lot and they're boring, and there's not a lot of room to explore there.
Agreed.
Humans, however, are so absolutely mutable that at the end of the day, I'd argue they're perhaps a bit more versatile than dwarves in that way.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
gonna play a dwarf?
Well, by the nature of having no expectations.
Right, exactly.
Whereas if you, with most fantasy races, unless the setting is wildly differentiated from the standard, that exists for all of them. If you're playing a human, you have no expectations. Who are you? If you're playing anything else, it's, are you a standard blank, or are you different, and if so, how? You either have to play into or against type. That is one of the drawbacks of most fantasy races.
Yeah.
You're either playing into type or against type. And that can get boring either way.
The core fantasy races, especially, although once we get into, gnome and halfling, it's like, all right, but what are yours like? Because between, even in Dungeons & Dragons, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition...
They've all been different.
They're all fucking, way different. The gnome's a little less so, but halflings, good lord, look at the difference in lore. Whereas dwarves, as we said, remain the same. Now... I
like hobbits and halflings for different reasons, but that's a different episode.
It sure is, and we will get into that. Okay, you said you've got your rebellious dwarf. What's another way you would have fun with a dwarfish race, either on the player side or on the DM side?
That's two separate questions for me. Because on the player side, really it is one or the other. I am playing against type, which I find fun, or playing the most stereotypical axe beard axe, Scottish accent, cleric of Thor dwarf that I could manage to make in whatever setting I'm playing. That would also be great.
Yeah.
Because it frees you up as a role player to enjoy yourself, because you have because all the stuff's right there on the page. You don't have to ad-lib. Your script is ready. You just act. It frees you up, and that's very relaxing. As a DM, I have fun with dwarves by putting them in a place where the players then immediately know what to expect from that character, and thus it allows me to shape what the players do next, because there's a dwarf in this slot. I know what dwarves do and who they are, so I'm going to move forward. I'm going to move forward. My next stratagem, the next thing I do, is going to be based on those assumptions. which allows me to either play into it and move things along smoothly, or play against it and kind of suppress my players really easily.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Who are you?
You know, as I said, I'm kind of at the point where I don't really want to play a dwarf anymore. But, because like once you've played, you know, the stereotypical dwarf, you know, I've got my axe and I am short and upset. You're Gimli. Once you've played Gimli, you don't need to play another Gimli unless you're that guy who always plays Gimli. And I know a couple of guys like that. But for me especially, I kind of, early in my dwarf-enjoying career, went into sort of a side burrow that's like a side stereotype about dwarves, which is like your dwarf rogues. Let's put it that way.
Oh, asshole dwarves.
Yeah, like the ones that are always grubby and messing with explosives, or, you know, the trappers and the...
Basically that one character from the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie.
Yeah, sure, kind of like that. And that's... I started getting more into the southern accent dwarves as a, you know...
As a way to differentiate them, yeah.
I believe my first character along that line's name was Ragnar Goldeater. He had a crossbow, or a hand crossbow, or maybe 2 hand crossbows, and he was only in it for the money, and I believe eventually like abandoned his party to die. But in using them as a DM, like you said, as you said, making them a constant, dwarves are usually probably the most second populous race in my settings and in my campaigns, even if I'm playing in like a default D&D, if such a thing exists.
Yeah, you know what? Thinking back, when you describe who someone is, if it's not human, or depending on the region, whatever is native to the region, it's probably a dwarf.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I'd never noticed that.
I think they subsume into culture really fucking well. They assimilate really well because it's not hard to understand their ways. Dwarves are long-lived, but they're such staunch traditionalists that they have an easy time separating history and the here and now. Whereas, compare that to elves, who are always kind of like in this ethereal, separate, you know, lifeline from other races.
Who are always the dying race.
Right.
And thus they're always looking backwards.
Right. Or have a poor concept of how time moves. Dwarves
Exactly.
work. They're salt of the earth. They're moving with their hands, and resources are finite before you need to move on to the next mine. And they are very much in the moment and appreciative of the history that has brought them here.
Actually, fun fact, this is entirely separate from, well, sort of related to how easily transferable dwarves are. You don't even need to make them short for them to be recognizably dwarves. Short is not the most important part of their culture. In the game I'm playing right now, the game I'm eating alive, Horizon Zero Dawn, there is a culture who are dwarves. They're called the Oseram, and they're dwarves. They're not short, but they're dwarves, and it's really, really clear.
You know, you mentioned that, and there's other games and other systems where it's, you know, I mean, you have that a lot, where you're like, okay, that's the elf, that's the dwarf, that's the gnome. What the fuck is the name of that MMORPG? I can't think of it off the top of my head. It's the one with the beast people and the plant people. They've got a
Guild
race
Wars 2?
Yes, you are absolutely right. They've got a race of creatures that are the gnomes. They're weird, floppy, amphibian-looking things, but they're the gnomes.
I like that about dwarves, that it's so easily that you can replace out what is, to most people when you first look at them, probably the most important part of them. You can take that out and it doesn't affect their clear trope readability at all.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of room to explore with dwarves. I like dwarves as people who quietly progress technology. They do it in a pragmatic fashion. You know, like blasting tunnels for mines, or, you know, creating defenses to keep people safe from shit that happens while you're working with important metals and stuff.
If a gnome is your wacky, crazy guy who invents flubber, if your gnome is the Robin Williams inventor, your dwarf is like Egon from the Ghostbusters.
Working in the realm of mad science, the both of them, yeah, that's absolutely fair. I'd say the dwarves are more like the Industrial Revolution waiting to happen, while gnomes are Elon Musk given a box of scraps in a cave. But, yeah, it's a fair comparison either way. I don't know. I like dwarves as a constant. You came up with a really romantic idea about humans that I'm not going to get into here. We'll save that for our humans podcast. What a weird podcast that will be the title. And but it's made me want to make humans not as much the majority as they typically are in a fantasy setting. They should feel a little more unique, and I think dwarves slot very well into that majority slot.
Into like cannibalizing the bits of humans that require them to be the majority.
Right. Okay, I think that covers it for both of us on that. Now, how about this question? Do you have any custom rules for your race, and how do you make them work specifically in your settings?
Well, the setting I use for D&D campaigns, which you'll probably be hearing a lot about in this series, so I'm not going to go too deep into it right now, is very regional. So how I handle dwarves varies really strongly by region. Normally, however, there are a couple constants. One, I tend to make them separatist. Regardless of where they are, they tend to have their own enclaves, their own, even if their culture is actually pretty wildly different from standard dwarven culture, they tend to have their own separate abodes. Two, and this is actually a coincidence that I noticed after the fact, I usually put them in the north. I didn't notice that I was doing that until recently, but I usually put them in the north. I noticed it because the dwarf I'm playing in your campaign, her dwarven homeland is in the far south. And my brain went, what? And then I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't not make sense. And then I went back and realized that they're almost always from the north. I don't know why that is. I think it's because I kind of connect them to Nordic tropes in terms of their pantheon.
Or dwarves are magnetic.
Canon.
No, we can't settle here, lad. Why not? Not far enough north. I can feel it in my bones.
They don't like going too far south. They're drawn to the snows. They think it's because they like the cold. No. If you went past the equator, suddenly they want to go south.
But otherwise, I mean, you slot pretty traditional dwarves, yeah?
Yeah, pretty much. And, like, their cultures will vary kind of far from standard dwarf, depending on where you are. Dwarves in one section of my setting, the Port Kingdoms, they don't really... they're probably the one set of dwarves who aren't separated in any way. They're very much mingled in society, and dwarven culture is thereby kind of subsumed by the local culture, by the local major religion, and it's sort of how to put this, tiny little tin pot king wars that just are going on and on, like the fantasy equivalent of the 100 Years' War. And they've kind of been subsumed in that because the place where I would normally slot them, all the mountains and ancient delves and all that, I haven't done something entirely different in that space, so I had to move them. So they're very different thereby. But honestly, it's very regional. It depends on what the needs of that part of the setting are.
I've taken a lot of your theory, your basis, the idea behind which to create a setting when I'm establishing my most recent D&D setting. It's one of those beautiful things that I don't feel like I have to publish, so it doesn't take a lot of effort to just throw something somewhere. I don't feel like I have to scrub the serial numbers off. Back when I was trying to, go, but how can I make an enterprise out of this with literally everything I attempted to do? So, like, I have wholeheartedly ripped off Dragon Age dwarves. Happily.
They're great.
I love them. I love them possibly more than regular dwarves, like, just in terms of what makes me interested. But I call them gold dwarves. I use the D&D, sub-race things, and they have their own little set of stats, more charisma and mercantile based. And, like,
And you don't even really use... Gold dwarves aren't even really, like, all Dragon Age dwarves. They're specifically House Balin and the Carta.
They're
like, they're not the more traditional houses of Orzammar. Like, Harrowmont wouldn't fit in with gold dwarves. That is the split.
No, yeah.
They're very forward focused. They're very focused towards, going out into the world and, making money and being a part of the future and building the future.
Yeah.
And that's very much, like, it is part of Dragon Age dwarves, but not the ones in Orzammar.
No, and that's kind of, specifically, well, I haven't established a lot of very hard rules about my campaign. It's in its infancy, my setting, as compared to yours. So I don't have as many specific things about, who goes here, who goes there. But you're absolutely right. Gold Dwarves are, even in my setting, the surfacers, the ones who are hanging out with other races and mingling really heavily. If you go back to Dwarven lands,
You get standard dwarves.
you're going to get more standard dwarves.
Which fits. You need those. You need the more standard dwarves. You need the Orzammar traditionalists for House Balin and the Carta, and like for those guys to make sense.
And Dukin, I think, the house.
Yeah, House Idukin.
Balin was the dude, yeah.
Balin's. I don't. It's been years since.
No, yeah, same.
drag
I
me,
don't know
nerds.
why you're pulling all these names out, and my brain is doing this uncorking thing where it's like, here's knowledge you forgot you had. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Because those dwarves still exist in my setting. They're still, your Scottish dwarves. They're still, like Norwegian sort of dwarves. They're just elsewhere. But there's not any other like specific way. That's the beautiful thing, and I kind of mentioned it earlier. They're common. They're here, and it would be just as easy for me to use them as isolated races, and they would still play pretty much the same. Dwarf is dwarf, We've managed to fill most of a podcast on that sentiment, but they don't need a lot of special rules like other races to fit into a campaign setting, and that's the beauty of them.
It's good to introduce that segment now with dwarves because we're gonna be getting into the weeds on that a little later.
I mean, and as we've got about 5 minutes left to fill here, we'll give you a teaser for the future. As we said before, halflings in Dungeons and Dragons and gnomes can be a little different. And then you get into the more out there races. Even if we only did core book shit, you have tieflings, you have dragonborn.
And let's not forget the most divisive episode that we're ever going to record on the Two Nerds podcast.
Are we?
Oh, we are!
I believe I'm in charge of the podcast.
We're recording an episode on half-elves.
I hope I have some information to fill that half hour during that. And it's not just you talking for half an hour with intermittent responses from me as in like, yeah, totally. Yeah, they're totally a real thing that's real. That's a teaser. I'm not going to get into that now.
No.
You guys got to wet that palate.
We're not elaborating on that.
But then there's the exploring beyond that. Dwarf is that standard. Where I think most people would say human fits that logic too, but like I said, I've moved away from that. In the future, other races are going to be really like, how do lizard folk fit into your world? What do you like about lizard folk? And I mean, a goddamn lot, if I'm being honest. But it's exciting, and dwarves delightfully aren't that exciting for me, and that's a good thing. I feel like you need races that are both so acceptable, but also not like wowee.
It's like food. In a good dish, it's not just the high notes.
Right.
It's not just the, incredible tartness of lemon or the real acidity of, like... Tomatoes, yeah. You need the mellow. You need the undercurrent. Your curry needs rice on the bottom of it.
I agree.
Like, otherwise it's just... Otherwise, it's lacking that balance, and so it's not satisfying to eat. Fantasy races are sort of the same thing, and dwarf is this tortured metaphor needs to be put down like a dog with rabies. Dwarf is your rice. It's the bed upon which the rest of the fantasy races rest because it's the most stable.
I argue that humans are the rice. Dwarves are a big, thick chunk of bread. Lots of crust. Maybe some seeds. I've just created this visual in my head of a dude with stew, and like a dwarf to me is like, I'm a big chunk of bread. I'm saying this out loud on the internet. Fuck it.
Can you tell it's the last 30 seconds, ladies and gentlemen? Listen, after races, we got a bunch of other stuff we want to cover.
We'll see where it goes from there. We're going to start with the core book races, and we're going to get into maybe expanded stuff beyond that, maybe not. Maybe we'll be so hungry to get into classes just for, something to cleanse our palate. I'd love to get into backgrounds, because I think there's so much limitless potential in a good background.
Basically, we're going to be doing a lot to cover D&D good.
It is. We want to keep that D&D train a-rolling. This is the year of Dungeons & Dragons.
In so many ways. But, for now, everything's better when nerds talk about it.